All right, everybody, welcome. My name is Dan. This is ZeetoMedia. We're a digital ad agency here based in San Diego. We're excited to host our first meetup here. I'm sure you probably know Mike from some of the older meetups. So if you guys have any suggestions or comments about how we can make it better, let us know. Pizza, beer, and food are over there on the bar, and if you need to use the bathrooms, they're right through the store on the left. So this is Mike. Take it away.
Thanks, Dan. So welcome, everybody. So I did get a lot of feedback from folks that you had some experience with one or maybe a few of these. So by a show of hands, how many of you have some experience, any at all really, with Grunt? And then how many have some experience with Gulp? And then how many have experience with broccoli? Couple hands come up. Oh yeah, sure. The Ember developer, right? So that's by the way our spokesperson, our PR guy for the company. So I doubt very much he has experience with broccoli. Yeah. He's on the bleeding edge of marketing. So again, my name is Mike Roberts. I'm a full stack developer, so I mostly work in the node world on the server side, and then on the client side, we do a lot of Angular stuff. We're really kind of getting into the mean stack now, so it's kind of what we do here on my team at Zeto. I started what used to be called San Diego Boot Camps. We're now rebranded as San Diego. And I do know that there's a SoCal Code Camp. We're not trying to ride on their coattails, but I think this better communicates that we are kind of a technology group and not like a physical fitness boot camp type thing. Been confusing some folks. So, and then that's my Twitter handle and my LinkedIn. So, without any further ado, old school workflows. I guess we're all, if we're in the modern age now, working with either less or SAS and trying to like step up our game with our styling and our style sheets. And then how many of you, after you've kind of gotten everything dialed in fairly well, want to go through the optimization phase where you want to like make sure everything is minified, concatenated before you push things up. And so it's a lot of this. That's you?
Yeah, sure. Are the slides going to be available later?
They are. So we'll definitely post them. Any other questions before I want to make sure that if you do have any questions, feel free to stop me. We have plenty of time. So this is a very casual, relaxed environment. This is a pretty standard development workflow where you're going to go through this process, and then as you get close to the point where you think everything's stable, you've kind of tested things locally, it looks kind of nice and pretty, you're ready to FTP it, get it up on a server somewhere, and let your boss or your friends take a look at your work and kind of shine. But inevitably something is broken, no big deal, right? Just rinse and repeat the entire process. Go back to the drawing board, fix whatever your styling issues are, make the change, and so you end up doing a lot of what I call like bricklaying, where you're basically doing a lot of the same repetitive tasks and processes over and over and over again. And then somehow miraculously, like Grunt appears, right? Those of you that have used Grunt and like you think it's the greatest thing since sliced bread, right? Because now there's a lot less of this over and over and over repetitive process, but instead you're on a more modern workflow, you're using a task runner. So the first thing to kind of cover is, I guess there, in many people's minds, are real significant differences between task runners and build tools. I'm not like that big into the whole dogma of like something having to fit into that specific box, but the argument can be made that some of them are leaning more on one side of the fence than they are on the other. So as an example, a pure task runner is really just something that's designed to complete tasks or execute tasks. So a good example of that would be like make. So those of you that are familiar with having to like build something or compile something on your server in the cloud, you've probably had to compile something using make in the past. So even if you're not an expert on that, you may have had to touch a build tool in the past to get your work done, to compile something. So task runners, that's task runners. I'm sorry, I meant build tools. So task runners, on the other hand, are like you're usually automating some process over and over and over again. So a good example of that would be like you need to constantly FTP files from one location that you're working on up to your site. So that would be the more classic definition of a task runner. A build tool is like make, right? So it's the opposite. So in most cases, you're going to be in a situation where you want to be able to like take care of repetitive tasks over and over and over again. You have a specific tool for that, and it may also build things because there's other plugins, other things that kind of work with it to make it behave in the other manner. Like, common example is you have some inputs and then you want to translate them into some outputs. Maybe you have CoffeeScript and you want to automatically translate CoffeeScript into JavaScript and then be able to push that out into production. So if you were to label each of these, Grunt, Gulp, and Broccoli, if you had to put them into a box, Grunt is more purely a task running tool. So you use Grunt to be able to kick off tasks, and those tasks are going to do something like minify your file, or uglify your code, or push it up in the FTP, or watch for a change in the file structure and then kick off some events. And then if you were to look at Gulp, and again, I'll go through these in more detail, you could put that kind of more closely on the build tool side, but it really could be looked at as a task runner as well. It's a little bit closer to a build tool because it really is like piping inputs in and taking them into like an output and producing something at the other end. And it can be used to also run tasks, but more than likely you're using some hybrid combination of Gulp to do some build type things and Gulp to do some task running as well. And again, the major difference you're going to find between Grunt and Gulp is just going to be how it actually approaches and tackles each of those problems, like repetitively executing tasks, and then how it actually outputs the files. And then finally, you have Broccoli, which is closer to Gulp in how it's actually set up its philosophy, but it calls itself and considers itself more of a pure build tool because it's a very small, very specialized, very small core API, and then lots of plugins that are wrapped around it, and it's generally used to build, just to take a tree in and then give you some kind of output. And then it can be used in conjunction with like Grunt or Gulp. And so in many cases, you're going to use Broccoli in conjunction with the task runner. You may not necessarily just use it as a standalone, like out of the box. Although I'm not an Ember developer, and so I'll kind of mention that now. Broccoli is really bleeding edge. So of these, Broccoli is the newest kid on the block, although it's been around for a while. And even like up to this year, there's still like Windows support is kind of spotty. So it really is for like front-end developers, very comfortable usually in a Mac environment because that's where it's going to work best. And it usually kind of works pretty well with the Ember command line tool. So it's kind of part of their whole world and their ecosystem. So if you're in the Ember world, then it's something you're probably very familiar with. So this would be a good example of like a typical build task. So if you wanted to basically say compile all your JavaScript files together in something like Ant, how many of you guys are familiar with Ant or have used that in the past? Okay, so this gobbledygook has all now been distilled down into, in a Grunt file, a lot less code, right? Simply taking something in, running the task against it, and then outputting your minification. So a lot less work now, and then obviously now we've decided that like JSON is the new hotness, right? And so everything is going from like old school XML, which we thought, remember we thought that was like awesome, like the greatest thing was XML because it was so semantic and all this extra good stuff in there. And now it's like, yeah, we don't really need that. Like, let's just move on to what's inside. So in a more modern workflow, you actually could be kind of going across and back and forth between your development cycle, your build cycle, your deployments. And so you have tools that are in the development category that do things like scaffolding, do things like linting your code, and then things like live reload or like browser reload, where you're able, or browser sync, we're able to kind of synchronize a bunch of browsers and at the same time do some testing to make sure everything kind of looks the same and behaves the same across a bunch of different browsers all in like one user interface. So again, many of these tools kind of fit somewhere along the spectrum. I kind of use Yeoman as an example of a good scaffolding tool that would be used on the development side. Maybe when you're first starting a project, you kick off like an Angular seed project, or you kick off something that just scaffolds something quickly. And then from there, in many cases, it has a built-in preference for either Gulp or Grunt, and then you can run those tools to either do like watches or to do your regular build process. And again, one of those could be in the Ember case. It could be like deferring to Broccoli, where you're doing your compilation, maybe doing some minification and concatenation. By the time you then get to the deployment, you're back to using probably a Grunt or a Gulp to be pushing that out to your CDN or up to your cloud, wherever your server is hosted at. So that's when you're running things like test runners, where you're cache busting and like changing the file names so they're like versioned differently. Again, a lot of that is accomplished fairly trivially in Grunt or Gulp. So if we look at just the pure numbers, and this is kind of skewed, this is just kind of over the course of, I guess, like, what, about a 2-week period or so. You look at the number of installations, which again is a, kind of a skewed number because Grunt's been around for a whole lot longer than Gulp, and then Gulp has been around for a whole lot longer than Broccoli. So you should anticipate that these are kind of, you know, at different run rates. Grunt, since it's been around for a long time, it's fairly stable. Lots of people have contributed to it, so you see a lot more downloads, you see a lot more plugins, and about half that as you move your way over to Gulp. But Gulp is like picked up a lot of steam. It's only been out for a little while. A lot of the folks that contribute to Gulp are really excited about the, you know, just the major philosophical difference between how you actually like configure and you know set up your task runner. And again, I'll get into that detail in just a little bit, but all of them are easy to install. All of them require Node. So how many of you guys are familiar with Node or are comfortable with like setting up Node and at least like installing something through npm? If you're not, it's not a huge deal. Node's not a very user interface, graphical user interface type application. It's a command line tool, but it's not as intimidating as one might think when you have to consider other tools that have come before it. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I was just wondering, so are they doing semantic versioning for Grunt, Gulp, and Broccoli, or are they just all using their own different versions?
They're all using your own little version, like version numbering system. So like you can see Grunt is only at version like 0.45. The next like major release people are anticipating is the 5.0, and then there's like talk about whether it's going to like go to all the way to 1 or whether 5 is going to be the next one. Based on the numbering sequence, I would guess that 5 is going to be the next one, and that's where they're going to supposedly be baking in some things that are more Gulp-like, which I'll cover in just a little bit. But you know, the general philosophy I think with Grunt is they're still calling it like a beta tool, right? It's still on the 0 dot, as well as like Broccoli is still considered very, very beta. And then when you see an established version number like 3.8, you assume like that this is like ready to go. This is production ready. Right. And the reality is, it really is, because it's just Node. I mean, we're just kind of using Node and utilizing it in a little bit different of a manner than Grunt, which is a little bit more of like a separate tool. Which again, will make it a little bit more sense when I kind of cover, you know, how they approach the philosophy, code over configuration. So does that kind of help? Yeah. You know, versioning is like all over the map. Be great if it was more consistent, but what you can read from these numbers is that Grunt still considers itself, even though it is like the granddaddy of them all, considers itself to be beta. But I mean, everybody's using it in production. People use it all over in production, and it's in a lot of the, if you scaffold out applications using the Yeoman generator or Slush or Sail or any of the other ones, a lot of them do have some preferences for Grunt just because it's been around for a long time. People are writing a lot of plugins for it.
It might also be afraid of like liabilities or something.
Yeah, they may want to just kind of, you know, fly under the radar. I mean, one of the things that we're experiencing in the front end is just there's a variety of things. Like there's an explosion of people contributing, and it's great that there's lots of like people innovating. A lot of people are working on a lot of the same stuff, whereas in the past people would be more collaborative and working together to solve the same problem together instead of like going off in different directions and tweaking things and doing things slightly different. It's also really easy, maybe too easy for people to contribute. So like anybody can throw a package up on NPM, and then if it becomes popular, great. And if it like sucks and has something in it that's really dangerous, like, oh well, everybody kind of has to deal with that. So it's like some of the pain points that we have with open source are kind of even more exacerbated by how fast we're running on the front end right now. And again, it's just something where you have to kind of, in their case, be careful. Like you said, maybe they want to just stay in the beta phase so they don't have to worry too much about someone saying, I tried your software, I expected it to work. So yeah, here's what it is. In terms of like downloads yesterday, again, you would see if we charted like what the rates are. I think a bigger like increase in the number of like downloads coming with Gulp, and Broccoli is going to, I think, stay kind of fairly flat because, again, it is kind of a small niche group of folks that are on that. So all these stats come directly from NPM, so they were current as of a day or so ago. Big difference is going to be like in the plugins, although, again, Some of this is not necessarily like a one-to-one. So as an example, you may have like 4,000 plugins, but there may be more things that are kind of more intuitive inside of Gulp that you don't need as many plugins for. Where there are some gaps is going to be on the Broccoli side, where because Broccoli is such a small core and it's designed to be very small in core and lots of other like helper or what they call helper packages, lots of other plugins need to be made available for it to be as like robust as some of these other tools. So Grunt, what they call the JavaScript task runner, like the Ohio State. So it's the oldest, as I mentioned, largest community by far, and just because it's been around and because it was like this huge like miracle that landed on our lap, right? When you, for those of you that had experience to work with Grunt and the things you were doing before, and then the amazing like just speed at which you could just like drop things in and like have Grunt just take care of stuff for you was like, wow. And it will do that, and all you have to do is type grunt serve. The window will just open up on its own, and site's up. Great, love that. But there's some major difference, and I'll cover that now, I guess, and that is at the bottom there, configuration over code. The philosophy was that Grunt sort of like wires things up in the background, and you basically say, I want you to, based on this JSON file, execute these particular tasks. And so the way that you determine how it's going to like do the tasks is you configure this big JSON file and you feed it instructions through configuration of that one file. And so it ends up being this monolith configuration file that in some cases is great because if you're building it from scratch, you kind of know where everything is. But in some cases, when it's handed to you and you have to jump on a project, you've got this huge configuration file that is very difficult, not very intuitive, not very discoverable for you to figure out what it's doing and how it's doing it. And so it can be a challenge for you to like jump on projects and become productive if you didn't like hand code the configuration. And for those folks that are developers that are comfortable in code, just didn't feel very natural for some folks to be in that environment. It still doesn't feel natural for some folks to be in that environment where you're configuring a file and then letting it do its work. So that's where it differs drastically from Gulp. Gulp is exactly the other way around. It's code over configuration. Again, as I showed you before, a large supply of plugins available for Grunt. So you can't really go wrong by using Grunt, except you just may not be as comfortable, may not be as fun of an experience. I think sometimes it's just really slow if you've got lots of tasks. So as an example, if you're working on a collaborative project and as you start working with more developers and you start individually working on more and more modules, start having more and more files that get included in the build process, and there's no like cache, like where it's just going to say, oh, this file hasn't changed, so I'm not going to do a complete rebuild. Oh, no. It's going to do a complete rebuild. Like every time you go through the build part of a Grunt, it's going to like set up a temporary folder because it doesn't have any like system to be able to pipe things in memory. It's going to set up a temporary file. It's going to do all the minification. When it's done with that, stuffing them all in the temporary folder, then it's going to grab those files and do the next task. It's going to go one by one through that process. So the more files you put in there, the larger your project grows, the slower your build process is going to be as you're kind of going through it. So again, that's the attribution of Grunt being slower than the other ones. It's just because of the way it processes it. On the other hand, code over configuration means that you really can use as much or as little as Gulp, although you can to some extent with Grunt as well. You don't have to configure everything. You can use just a minimal set. But generally speaking, you can use an even smaller set of code to be able to say, I just want these particular features of Gulp. It's a lot more readable if you're comfortable with Node and developing JavaScript. That being said, you also do need to feel comfortable enough that you understand things like promises and callbacks, and so you do need to be a little bit more comfortable in the weeds of programming in JavaScript to feel comfortable in most cases with Gulp. Although in some cases, if you get something like it's a seed project and like out of the box Gulp is all set up for you, then it can be just as convenient when you're actually like, all I needed to do is watch my files, just type grunt watch and let it do its magic, and you don't have to worry about it, right? So if somebody is setting it up and that you're jumping on a project, Gulp is generally speaking easier for you to kind of absorb. It's more discoverable, at least from my developer experience. The speed advantages come from it doing things in memory. So instead of it being like a highly intensive input-output writing process as you're doing the actual build, the minification, concatenation, and then cache busting and changing the file names and all that, instead it's doing it all in memory, and it's like piping it through streams. Like as it finishes one process, it pipes it into another one. And so as it's doing these things in memory and piping it from one process to the other, you don't have that input-output write that's happening on disk. So because of that, things are going to execute a lot faster. Really good in situations where you're piping one in, one out. So in situations where you have like a bunch of files that are coming from like one folder and then they're all being concatenated into like one JavaScript file, works like a charm. Or when you're converting CoffeeScript into JavaScript, it's great. Same thing in terms of like the size of the community, really, really large like Grunt, although because it hasn't been around for as long, it hasn't had a chance to volume and numbers of plugins available. But those folks that like code over configuration usually like jump for joy when they hear there's something even better than Grunt. Like, you thought that was nice. Wait until you see Gulp, right? So Broccoli is the new kid on the block. So, and there are other new kids. So I'll cover a few other ones, but Broccoli touts itself as the fast client-side asset builder. So really, their niche is they want to be known as a really small API that helps to build assets. So the community, as I said, is geared around Ember because it like hooks into their CLI, and I think this is like the native way that you build using Ember. The build tool can be paired with Grunt though, so in the case where you're not an Ember developer and you really like the way Broccoli handles trees, which I'll cover in just a moment, then you could be like more than content saying, I'll do some of the stuff that I want to do as a task runner in Grunt, and then I'll use Broccoli for the good stuff, the good sauce that I like. So as an example, running some things through Broccoli will be a little bit faster in the build process because similar to Gulp, it's going to do some things in memory, and it's also going to rely on the plugins or the helper applications that it uses, the helper plugins that it uses to like cache. So if I'm not having to change a file that's being minified, and if it's like a one-to-one transform, so like let's say it's CoffeeScript, and I haven't modified the CoffeeScript file, and that CoffeeScript helper should be able to say, you know what, I'm not going to do another read of that file and convert it again. I'm just going to give you a cached version of it. So your rebuild should work a little bit faster using the Broccoli flow. And then the tree concept is just, instead of using like one file that's mapped to like another output, you use this concept of a tree, which could be like a glob of files or blob of files. And so it's usually like a folder or an object. So you're either pointing to a folder or you're pointing to an object that contains like, these are the files that I want this to be done with. You're passing a tree object on. And so most of the plugins will take a tree and then they'll give back a tree. And they'll do whatever their action is while they have it. So obviously you then have those like speed advantages over doing everything in Grunt. Although again, you could pair part of your build process in Broccoli with Grunt to do things like maybe turn on your like watcher to see if files have changed, or to push things up, do live reloads, things like that. So as an example of like Broccoli and trees. So fairly standard node stuff up there at the top. So you're going to require in all of your dependencies. And so if you were doing something where you're doing like the general concatenation minification stuff, then you'd probably want to include uglification, concat, the merge trees, and then maybe you're doing some CSS and you're using Sass, right? So you'll rely on all of those plugins. So you'll npm install each of those different plugins for Broccoli. You'll install your Broccoli, npm install Broccoli, and then once you have all that, the good stuff, then you're ready to actually, in this case, define lib, which are usually strings that correspond to a matching directory, or the tree might be like the output from one of the other like helpers, right? So it could be either the tree object or it could be like a pointer to a folder, right? And in the case of like, the next thing you're going to define is maybe like app.js, and then that's going to be a concatenation. So you're passing it into that helper. You're passing in what? You're passing in the tree, which in this case is this lib. And then you're telling it, here's my input files, just where they're located, and then my output files, and that tree object. So in this case, the tree object is anything that matches a JS is going to be dumped into my tree, and then the output is then going to be piped into this assets app.js file. So in the end, all of your JS files then should be concatenated into that one app.js file. Then from there, you probably want to say, okay, let me pipe that whole tree into a uglification, right? Make it look not pretty anymore. So all of your, for those of you that aren't familiar with uglification, all of your like variables that are called like Mike's great counter, all get shortened to like A, and the next one gets shortened to B. So when you're reading the code, it looks like gibberish, but it's a lot less characters, and so it's a little ugly, and so it's generally referred to as uglification. And then you may define like styles, which again is going to be a string, which is going to correspond or point to a folder called styles. And then that's going to be how Broccoli figures out, okay, all of those files in that folder are going to be in that tree. And then when you do something with it, and then maybe you compile that all into your output for Sass. And at the very end, you use something like merge trees, and that merges together both your app.js, your app CSS, and drops it into the public folder, which may also include like your index file. So it just does a one-to-one move of your index file from wherever your distribution or your development folders are into your distribution, your public folder. And everything's packaged up there in the public folder, ready to roll, right? Then you can take your Grunt and you can say, Grunt, watch this folder. When this folder changes, then go ahead and push this out and then turn on like a live reload so I can like see it in the browser and see what's going on. So that's the case for Broccoli. So any questions about any of the three that I've covered so far?
Question more about Jenkins, something comparable to
different tool kind of for like a different part of the process. So Jenkins is usually used to do like a build, like a, I guess, testing and then building, right? That would be the best explanation for what it does. So it runs your test to make sure that the build process actually works. And then usually you're like taking like a repository and then you're like running some script to make sure it builds and it builds properly. And then maybe like dropping it onto like a live production server so people can actually like see the site. So
yeah, there's a whole lot more, including maintaining versions
yeah,
for all contributors.
yeah, a lot more. But the core, right? But the core functionality is you use it to build, use it to run tests, build, and usually then to push off into production. So you could set it up to that if the tests actually all pass, then automatically move things along. But generally speaking, like if you don't have that like continuous deployment as well, you could just use it to run continuous integration, where once it gets pushed up to your repository, it can run a check and see if all the files are actually like passing tests and building properly, and then you're ready to move it live. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So you.
Is there other tools that do these?
Oh yeah, yeah. So these are kind of like the new hotness, right? These are the more popular ones, but there are folks that are like big fans of some of these other ones, like Brunch. So the thing with Brunch is that it's for mostly for front end stuff. So it does use like file based and not tree based, like the Broccoli, and it does partial rebuilding instead of caching. So again, just slightly different than the way that Gulp does it. It's the same way that Gulp and Grunt are all like fairly agnostic to platforms, whether you're like Python developer using Django or you're programming in Rails. You can utilize these same tools, same infrastructure. So there's just lots of new flavors of things out there. For those of you that are more like on the old school side, like Rake pipeline would be maybe more common in the Rails community. Rails SI pipeline obviously is more common in the Rails community. So there's lots of other flavors of like task runners. It's like flavor of the month pretty much right now. Wild Wild West. So, does anybody use any other ones I haven't mentioned so far? Anybody using like bash files, which I hear sometimes in the IRC channels? Are like, what do you need those for? You need bash files, man. What? With your fancy stuff. So, same thing. I mean, so to that, I like they aren't necessarily like they're more build tools, I guess. Yeoman and Slush. So Slush is slightly new. Anybody used Slush before? I haven't had a chance to play with it, but I've been looking at it like with googly eyes and drooling because it looks kind of fun. But very similar to Yeoman, which I love. How many of you guys have used Yeoman before? It's fun stuff. So so Slush has just a slightly different take on things, and like I said, it seems to be kind of same kind of philosophy of doing things in Node, but seems to be a little bit slimmer and easier to contribute than Yeoman, which I've heard can be kind of a bear to contribute to. Browserify is another interesting project out there that's kind of in this space. So if you had a very interesting Node package that like Node runs on the server side, so that's JavaScript on the server, that you wanted to be able to run on the client side in the browser, you could take a like Node package and you could browserify it so that it will run on the client side. So you run it through, and the process is to basically like require that package, and then you run it through, and it basically bundles all the dependencies. The big thing that you don't get with on the client side is you don't get all of those like running through to see what requires, like require does all that work for you and figures out like if you've got this and it requires a bunch of other things, just go ahead and install those things for you. So you don't get that goodness on the client side. So it runs through, figures out what's dependent, packages everything together, and then concatenates it into one JS file that you can then run client side stuff. So, so the winner is, which one, like hands down, is the winner? Not a real simple answer. For those folks that like arguing that Grunt is almost what they want in terms of a tool, the Grunt 5.0 is like, the hope is going to include more like streaming and piping of the files instead of having to like write everything input output onto the temp folder and then leaving all that mess in there. Again, it's unclear whether it's going to go right to 1 and they're just going to hang out there at 4.5 for a while. There have been spurts where there's very little activity on the core side, and then they make some moves. And so, again, still very stable in comparison to something like Broccoli, which is like very unstable for like Windows, up until like from beginning of the year through like maybe middle of the year towards like April. They had like race conditions that meant that you just couldn't guarantee what was going to happen when you're using Broccoli on a Windows machine, and they just fixed it like a little while ago, like a couple months back. So that's a big issue and big part of your community with big OS footprint is just completely shut out. So it's maybe really too early for folks in the Ember side, but again, if you are Ember on a Mac, you're fine, right? Because it's what fits together fairly well. You may have some existing ecosystem requirements. So as an example, if you Yeoman scaffold something out and it comes with Grunt, you may not want to go through all of the extra work of like, okay, let me retool this in Gulp because I like Gulp versus Grunt. Then again, you may just get sick and tired of Grunt and decide, let me just rewrite this in Gulp. So you may have existing requirements or a project where people have a strong preference, and so that may guide whether or not you stay on Grunt or you convert over to Gulp. Node comfort level is going to definitely be one that differentiates whether or not it makes sense for you to go in the Gulp direction, because again, it is more of a code over just configuring the Grunt file and just setting what you want it to look for, where you want to dump things. You can kind of work your way through that, but there's no like, let me just like piece this together like without knowing any Node on the Gulp side. You really do have to know some Node. And I'll show you an example just a bit. How does it feel? I mean, at the very end of the day, when people like talk about languages that they prefer to code in, a lot of it is just personal preference. Although something may execute slightly faster in another language, if you really like Node over Go, right? Go may be the next thing, right? The next cool language of du jour. But in the end, if it doesn't feel right, then stick with what works. I like JavaScript full stack, so I'm probably not going to be converting over to like Go or become a Java developer or something along those lines. And then finally, again, is it a good fit with a particular project that you have? If it's an Ember project, then you may want to bite the bullet and see if you can make it work with Broccoli. If there is enough out there, enough available plugins for the things that you want to do, it may fit very well into your existing infrastructure and into the team or project that you work with. Then you can always like mash things up if you're just on the cutting edge, right? You just want to be that rebel. You can grunt your Gulp. So it's entirely possible for you to use, there's a Gulp library for Gulp Grunt that you can basically say, as one of your Gulp tasks, run Grunt and do these particular tasks, right? So you'll run through, do those particular Grunt tasks, and then continue on and do some of your other like Gulp goodness. So take a little diversion, do whatever you're doing on the Gulp. Meanwhile, asynchronously, be doing the other stuff that you've got going on in your Gulp side. So again, I'll make these slides available. So the package that is there at the bottom, it is a real package with people that are downloading it and using it. So I don't know how successful they are in many cases, but you know, if you're already thinking about it and you want to maybe just kind of quickly dip your foot in the water, you may be able to like just quickly, you know, throw this together and then be able to use some of the other features of Gulp, like Gulp Watch or something else, to be able to, you know, keep using your Grunt tasks, but also be able to start mixing in a little bit of the Gulp here and there. So this would be an example of a, you know, like Grunt broccoli mashup, where again you're using Grunt and then you're triggering your broccoli build, and again see how it's like you're defining this JSON object that tells Grunt this is what you want to do. You're usually defining some inputs or whatever plugin that you want to use, and then how you want it to transform the information. So all these resources will be available. I think I pretty much covered each one of those. So those are the major sites for each of the, like the big ones, Grunt, Gulp, and Brunch, or Broccoli. Brunch, again, is fairly new. Everything with the IO is new. That's the new thing, right? If you got an IO, then you're awesome. It's just like .com before the big blow up. That's how you know you're cool, is if you get an IO at the end. So I'll show you some examples now of the actual files, and then have some time to answer some other questions if you guys have any. Anybody have any questions as I kind of transition over to some code? Don't be shy. Is that big enough for everybody to see? So this would be an example of a standard broccoli file, and this is the same one that I showed before. So you know, nothing new here. Basically, you've got, you know, defining your trees and then piping your trees into every one of those helper plugins. It looks simple because it is fairly simple and fairly trivial. It's intentionally made to be very, very small and to basically just work with trees. Just take a tree in, use one of the other outside libraries to then make manipulations on it. And it's designed to be that way so that you're not having to worry about breaking the core, which is one of the challenges that you have when you have it moving really fast and you're wanting to like iterate. You're always like cautious, like if we put too much into the core, we can't move as fast, we can't release as fast. So it's a pretty good, smart philosophy. I kind of like where they're going, but the team is kind of small, so our contributors are kind of small, and they're just kind of, they're in their own world, and the Ember world, right? It's its own thing, right? Just like Rails is like its thing, and .NET is kind of thing. JavaScript, we like to hug it out, right? But there are these pockets where the community is really tight, and their tools are like tight around that particular technology, it seems like. So they do kind of like go off in little silos sometimes. So next up, Grunt. So you'll see that this is a much larger and longer file, and typically you'll see these like really large, long files. This is from a Yeoman scaffolded out project. So this one is the Angular full stack, which is an Angular like mean stack generator. So it's not the mean IO or the mean JS project, but it's another one that exists out there. This one has a pretty nice like file structure. I'll just quickly kind of show you that the file structure is fairly well organized. This is the Grunt one. So it's got like a client folder that's got all your Angular stuff in it, and then you've got a nice server folder that's got really good organization of like the server-side node stuff. They give you a good example of like socket IO. They use Mongoose for the database connection in it. So it's a fairly good scaffold of it. I prefer it over both the mean.js and mean.io projects as a good scaffold. And they include, in this particular case, they use Grunt, and they include editor config, which Trey's big on, right? Editor config helps you like set up your files so that they stay consistent in things like your spacing and your like tabs versus spaces. I won't start that debate here, but it does help the whole team stay on that same either spaces or tabs and what the spacing is. So it keeps it a little bit more uniform and follows a standard basically that helps to make sure that you don't end up like one person blowing out the repository by taking all the spaces out of a file or something. And then, as I said, it includes Grunt. It includes some good testing packages, both client side, it uses Karma and Jasmine, and then on the server side, it's got Protractor set up, and it's all like dialed in, so you can pretty easily just go to town and start writing tests. So up at the top, you'll see that you start with just kind of setting up Grunt, setting up just a very basic configuration, and then loading the tasks, in this particular case, using like a just-in-time Grunt plugin. And in this case, it does do a pretty good job of like doing a Grunt serve, and it also makes available a build tool that kind of minifies things and gets things ready for a production or distribution version of it. Every Grunt file is always going to have this init config, and this is where you set up most of the configuration of the project. So in this case, you start by reading the package, make sure that you've got it does a pretty good job of reading some of your dependencies. It reads your Bower configuration inside of your HTML file, and from there it makes decisions about where it should go grab files to minify, concatenate, etc. So it's a fairly well structured Grunt configuration, but as you see, it's really long, very verbose, and it's got quite a bit going on. So again, inside of some of these, it knows to specifically look for particular files in the directories that scaffolded out for you and just grab certain things. Problem is, like, let's say you decide, well, I just don't need to do like any testing because testing's not cool because I don't know how to do it. So you want to start gutting those things. Very difficult for you to just jump into this and just gut just a few parts that you don't think are important. Like you're much more likely to just leave stuff in there and just deal with annoying messages that you're getting than to really dig into the file and start pulling out things that you're just not going to use. Some of it may be fairly trivial and easy for you to understand, but other parts give you a headache if you need to actually extricate and pull things out. Generally speaking, then towards the bottom, you'll then be able to like designate instead of having to type a particular like you may have a default Grunt task or set of tasks that you wanted to run. So if you just type Grunt, it will run just those default tasks. If instead you have very specific tasks, like instead of running a bunch of tasks, you just wanted to do something like just fire up a server, and you don't have to build and concatenate everything. I just want you to fire up a server and like let me actually see a production or a development version of the code. Not minified, doesn't need to be all uglified. Just get me something that I can actually start watching, and then like do live reload. If I change a file, watch the file, make sure if it changes, then you reload in the browser. And you may have situations where you also want to just run like just tests, right? So instead of you wanting to do the whole deployment, you want to just run tests. So in this case, if we go all the way through the file, we'll see some of the registered tasks. So if we are just doing like a Grunt serve, and if we just assume that we're doing just a general Grunt serve and we don't designate anything else, then it's going to say, okay, then you're doing it for distribution. And in that case, inside of your distribution, it's going to run like all of these tasks. So, sorry. So it's going to, clear out the temp folder and then start going through and injecting your SAS. It's going to make sure that you have all your dependencies, that wire dependency. It's going to auto prefix things, so you'll get some cache busting as well. If you go through and look at like just a normal, whatever when you type Grunt, whatever you expect to happen is going to happen there. So if you did Grunt test, it would just do these. So it's going to basically run through and do your Grunt test. Will do all of your end-to-end and do all of your like client-side tests. If you do like Grunt test client, it'll just do your client-side testing. So not terribly intuitive though. If you would like to look at this file and be able to kind of like determine, oh, I need to type Grunt test serve. Grunt test : E to E would be how you get this particular target to run. So unless you kind of like knew that, you probably would have a very difficult time figuring that out by just reading this configuration file. So you really have to have documentation that goes with the configuration to explain to you what it's doing all along, because otherwise it's just a disaster trying to figure this out on your own. What's that? Yeah, you could, but the problem is that this is like, it's a configuration file, so it's not going to be happy about comments in some areas, but I guess you could put some above and stuff. So Gulp is a lot shorter, doing about the same amount of tasks, but slightly shorter, but more discoverable, I think. So you can now see that there are specific tasks that are going to be run, like a styles task or a scripts task, an HTML task. And then you can kind of, as you go through, see, okay, well, it's going to take this and it's going to pipe it through, and it's going to go through the JS filter, then through Uglify. So it kind of makes sense that it's like stringing things along, and this is what it's going to move it through. And under the, like images task, it's going to do just this shorter set of steps versus a longer step that you may take when you're doing distribution. In addition to that, when you get down to like the ones that include a bunch of tasks, like build is going to also include this array of other tasks, like do the HTML task, do the images task, the fonts task, and the extras task. Anytime I do a grunt build, I'm sorry, a Gulp build. What's that?
So when you're defining your task dependencies like that, is that the order that they're going to be running, or is it asynchronous?
No, it's going to run them in that order. I don't believe they do them asynchronously. Do you know if it does it asynchronously? I think it does them one at a time, because that's the pipe. So
Actually, with Gulp, it's going to try to run everything in parallel if it can.
if it can't, so how does it determine, like, if there's like, because you can't uglify and concatenate at once, right? It's
Yeah,
the
so
same
you have
file.
to like change, you have to.
Yeah, so I think that, yeah, so I would guess then that, I don't know, I would guess that you may be safe, because in each one of these tasks, it may know to like stay away from like trying to do two at the same time.
Well, like he said, if you set up a task dependency on the task that you're calling,
Right.
so then you can.
It knows to
kind of
wait,
enforce
right?
I've run into some problems with that, but in general, if you just put them in the array, it's going to try the shotgun those.
Yeah. Parallel first.
Going back to your speed point.
Right. Yeah.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
Go before.
Okay, that's good to know. So in general, you're going to want to probably use like Gulp Task Connect out of the box. So it'll use Connect to spin up a little like node server. So again, really easy to like use this in a regular day-to-day development workflow. Bower components, this is also super helpful. So it will kind of know that if you're being smart, you're using Bower to make sure you keep all your dependencies all up to date, then it's going to also try and help you out by saying, oh, I noticed that you are using Bower to monitor and make sure you have the latest version of Angular. Great. I will also help you out and make sure that we do what we need to do to like concatenate them together or do whatever the other tasks are that it wants to do. So, and it also will it'll bark at you real loud if it finds out that a required dependency has not been installed. Right away tell you, hey, you need to handle that. So any other questions, comments, concerns?
Which one do you guys use?
Because we recently scaffolded out using that Angular full stack, we're currently just plowing our way through using Grunt, but we are in the process of moving back over to Gulp. But it's a good, I think it's a good process to sometimes have where you scaffold something out and it becomes like a proof of concept almost. Like now that we know that this is fairly stable and we're actually starting to kind of like make some improvements and change some of our process on it, it's a good time for us to now say, okay, training wheels are off. Now we don't really need to scaffold anymore. Like we're stable. We know we're going to use all these things. Now let's just move it over and like rewrite exactly what we need in Gulp. It'll be much easier and simpler because we know from the ground up exactly what we want to include what things we want to do, what things we don't want to do, and when we want to enforce those. Like for us, it's sometimes it's nice to not have minification, nullification, but we also do want to make sure that like we are testing locally something that's very close to what we're going to be pushing up in production. Because like in Angular, for example, if you're not like annotating your Angular functions and suddenly you concatenate things together and uglify it, bust out all your Angular and everything breaks, like you want to just be able to have some of those like tests in place. So it's not like, oh, the only time we minify things is when we're right about to push it out to production. Like this package actually does do a good job of having that like distribution version. Like when you're running grunt serve, you can actually run a grunt serve :dist. Then it will actually do that distribution version, package it up, and then use that to show in the local node. So that kind of helps with that process, just to make sure you're just a little bit closer when you're testing to what you're going to have out in the wild. So, but yeah, I think most of us that have used, like you've dabbled a little bit in Gulp before, like we just enjoy Gulp over grunts. Yeah. Is there anybody that has had experience with either and loves Grunt over Gulp? I'd like to know the reasons and rationales behind that, because most people tend to favor Gulp, especially if you're like wanting to start and make it discoverable and easy for you to just pick up and use. Most of us are developers. That's why we're here. We want to like put our hands in the code and like have more comfort level, knowing we can control things versus like having to figure out how it wants to be configured. All right, any other questions, comments, or concerns? Thank you. I'm going to now introduce Todd, who's going to talk a little bit about